Yeah, we're back. We're going to be talking now with Scott Borg. I first met Scott at InfoWarCon '97. Somehow he ended up on the speaking schedule, and I sat and my jaw dropped. No pressure on you at all here, Scott, with his views. And one of the things that he brought to the table back then was, and asked me the question, how much does cyber war cost? And I go, I have no idea how to even begin something like that. And so he's a professional economist and a geek and all these other things. And I don't know where he's going with this one, but engage away. The next hour is yours, Scott.
Okay, so I'm a little bit impaired, so I have to sit down. I can't see. I'm partly blind today, and which is why my eyes look so strange, and I need to sit. But what I really wanted to do with this time was to actually turn off sound and everything and do a brainstorming session on cyber war, understanding that it's not really going to be a real-time thing at all. And we've had, in the course of the last 2 days, a bunch of insights I'd like to talk about and draw together. However, that was not what I was asked here to do. So before I try to do that, and assuming there's time to do that, I promised to talk about whatever you folks want me to talk about. And then I realized there are enough people here who don't know what I've been doing the last decade that I better lay out some of the basics of that first so you know what kind of questions you can ask. So what I've been doing for the last dozen years, or more actually, is working my way through cybersecurity using concepts mostly from economics, to some degree from game theory, a bit from anthropology and ecology, but mostly from economics. And I've been probably the main proponent of a risk-based approach to cybersecurity, and some of the other people who endorse this have actually based their remarks on memos and things that I've written and other things that I've written. So I'd like to start by talking about what this risk-based approach to cybersecurity is and why it can eat the whole field, why it can incorporate all of the different other aspects of cybersecurity, including cyber warfare. My name is Borg, and I could put a slide saying, you will be assimilated and resistance is futile, and because that's actually what economics does to this field. It kind of takes it, gobbles it up. When I start talking about a risk-based approach to cybersecurity, people immediately think of some things that are just profoundly wrong. So I'd like to begin by pointing out what it's not and what won't work. Can't see well enough to hit the right slide. Okay. Whenever we hear somebody talking about protecting high-value assets, we know they're protecting the wrong thing, and we know they don't understand how to do cyber risk properly. You have to, in fact, in order to do your CSIP exam and get the questions right, you have to put down things about protecting assets that are just wrong. And so these misconceptions about this are very widespread. The value of an asset has very little, often no relation at all, to the amount of damage you can do by attacking that asset. I mean, you can often run a cyber attack in an industrial system on a cheap, overlooked measuring device that doesn't even show up as a noticeable item on any budget, and totally destroy the corporation that you're attacking, do mammoth damage. By, for instance, making all the drug output defective so that it lets people die or even kills them. And if you're curious about that out of the air example, I can explain that we actually figured out how to do that. All my examples are real. For the last dozen years, I've had people on the ground, and I've been myself on the ground in critical infrastructure industries with carte blanche to ask questions in most cases, total access to records. We've been inside of all the main critical infrastructures, and we figured out how to destroy them, my colleagues and I, and then I figured out how to quantify the effects and its impact on the economy and so on. Assets, the other reason people shouldn't think about protecting valued assets is value doesn't reside in assets. The important value is the value that an organization is creating, whether it's business or military or government. The organization is doing something that creates value. And when you damage it, what you want to do if you're an attacker and you want to damage it, is you want to take away its ability to create value or greatly reduce the amount of value it creates. And the physical damage to an organization, the physical damage to anything, is usually relatively small in cost compared to the functions that you're interrupting. When we have a hurricane, the physical damage of the hurricane even is not where most of the value is destroyed. It was taking out putting that city out of business, all those people out of work, all those enterprises, preventing them from carrying on for those many weeks or months is usually where most of the value destruction is. And you can't value assets by what their outputs are because you don't really care what their outputs are individually. You want to know how they work collectively. Those of you who know about marginal utility can understand that one quickly. And often, a really devastating cyber attack won't have any observable effect on any particular asset. So you just don't want to look at assets. The other big misconception about a value-based approach, a risk-based approach, and a big misconception just about risk is that it has to be about statistics. Even while I've been here, when people heard that don't know my work heard what I do, they say, oh, you must have a big background in statistics and so on. Actually, I do, but it's almost completely irrelevant for cybersecurity. One reason is that you can't do trend lines. You can't extrapolate. Bad cyber attacks just suddenly erupt. They're not the culmination of a gradual trend that you can extrapolate into the future. A really devastating cyber attack will not be there, and then all of a sudden it will be there, and sometimes it will taper off gradually, and sometimes it will also fall by the wayside. What that means is you can't model uncertainty in cyber realm by bell-shaped curves, by normal distributions. If we're talking about risk of death, we have a life expectancy number. As you approach that life expectancy number, more and more people die. As you pass it, fewer and fewer people die. You get a nice bell-shaped curve. Cyber, as I said, with trend lines, you'll get nothing, and then all of a sudden you'll get a huge amount of something. The information that you have on things is not usually symmetrically arranged. So you can't model uncertainty with bell-shaped curves. That also means that you can't use standard deviations. You can't use statistical significant tests the way you can elsewhere. This is not to say you can't model uncertainty. It's to say you can't do it in classic statistical ways.
Don't you need to see the normal picture, and that is statistics, to see when there is a difference
baseline.
By the baseline?
We use certain statistical techniques for detecting abnormalities. The most complex math that I ever use, or that my colleagues actually ever do for me, is multivariable change point detection. And so we do, which is a statistical technique. So we do things like that. But by and large, what we do is not statistically based, and the kind of analysis I'm going to be explaining is not. It's not based in conventional statistics, what people think of as statistics. We model uncertainty and we talk about confidence, and but we're not doing it with these kinds of techniques. You don't have independent variable probabilities mostly in the cyber realm. I mean, there are many examples of each of these. I'm just picking one to give you the idea for each. When you've got a cyber attack, when something bad happens in a cyber realm, the next bad thing is not an independent variable. An attacker is going to seize the opportunity to do something when something bad is already happening. Another attacker might build onto that, and so on. So when Russia is invading Georgia, that's when the cyber campaign takes place. And when the cyber campaign is taking place, that's when organized crime is also going to be inserting malware into the financial institution computers in Georgia. And that's also when, and so on. None of these are independent variables, and in general, nothing in cyber is, because you're dealing with malicious actors who are clever, who are taking advantage. Sampling theory doesn't much work. We're not like taking random samples from random populations and then using statistical analysis of that. It's just the data isn't there. It's not how we collect data. It's not what we're using. Typically, we're using all the data we've got, not sampling from a body of data. Bayesian corrections. Bayesian corrections also don't work. I mean, suppose you say that there's a certain percentage 90% probability of something happening in the next 3 years, and you go through 2.5 years and it hasn't happened, and you want to now do a Bayesian correction. Do you say, well, it's now become overwhelmingly more likely in the remaining 6 months? Or do you say, oh, it's not as likely as we thought, so it's enormously less likely in the remaining 6 months? Unless you know something else, you can't apply the Bayesian analysis, Bayesian approach to this. And if you know those other things, the Bayesian approach is going to be superfluous, which I'll make clear in a minute. So what do? Whoops. We do mechanisms. All the work that I do is about digging into mechanisms. If you know the mechanism by which two things are related, you don't have to worry about statistical correlations. If you know the mechanism that connects them. If you know what the mechanism is that will generate an event, you don't need to be looking at trend lines and so on. You can watch the components of the mechanism and you can watch this all happen. If you know the mechanism that will lead to a consequence, you don't have to have a lot of prior examples of that consequence and do some kind of statistical analysis of what you can actually calculate the consequence. This is how we do it in most engineering. We know mechanisms. This is how most science works. Social sciences thinks that science works by statistics. It's not how chemists, molecular biologists, it's not how most scientists work. Most science works by digging into mechanisms. So the way to do a risk-based approach to cyber is to dig into the mechanisms, to figure out how things work. No black boxes, no assumptions about what is in this space. We, lift up the lid, look at the engine, we look at the gears. And that's also why, although most of my actual creative work is actually just theory, it's why it's been so useful to be walking around power stations and chemical plants and refineries and things and figuring out how to destroy them. Cybersecurity, for most of its history, and even now to a large degree, has used this picture of the world. We have a picture of a cyber attacks, and we have a picture of penetration, and we do pen tests, and we try to keep people from penetrating things, and we use words as though they're synonymous with cyber attack that mean penetration, that mean words like breach and so on. I mean, this is too often how we're looking at things. You get people who talk about doing a threat analysis. What they usually mean is they're looking at trends in vulnerabilities and exploits for penetration. And they talk about, well, we're doing a metric for risk reduction, and what they really mean is they're doing a metric for work progress in dealing with penetration. It's like been really narrow. If you're going to look at mechanisms, this is not going to do it, because you have to at least look where the mechanisms are. If you want to look at what the mechanisms are that connect these things, you've got to look at where those mechanisms are being carried out, where they're happening. So that means you, at minimum, have to start looking at this kind of picture. You have to start looking at the threats, not as trends in exploits. And you need to look at the threats and where they're coming from and how they're structured, what's going on there. You need to do the same with consequences, and you need to look at vulnerabilities in a much more comprehensive way.
Is the threat, are you talking technical threat or human? Which element are there, or both?
I'm going to show you how we take each one of them apart next. So what I'm going to do next, and all I'm going to do before I hope to move on to other things, is quickly give you the basics for how we take apart threats, consequences, and vulnerabilities in order to do a proper risk-based approach, make it quantitative, talking about how we figure out the mechanisms of what they are. So threats, so basically what we're going to do is we're going to start filling this in. So in threats, I'm going to be talking about the components of threats. A lot of people have been talking about threats in terms of black swans. Is it Nassim Taleb, I think, popularized this in the book, The Black Swans. I've heard people talk about, well, the really bad cyber attacks are just black swans, so you can't do a risk-based approach because they're just going to come out of nowhere. In fact, of course, we can predict black swans. If you knew, for example, that there were swans in the vicinity of Australia, and you knew there were rivers there that were perfect environments for swans, and you knew the rivers were populated with sturgeons that eat swans, and you knew that the sturgeons pick out swans because they're light colored on the surface, and you knew that some swans are occasionally born that aren't pure white, that are kind of gray, you could pretty quickly begin to predict black swans. You could figure out that the differentials will be that we'll select for darker and darker swans until we eventually get something close to black ones. And so black swans are predictable. And so the way we predict cyber attacks and new threats is by going after them the way we would predict black swans. We look at what kinds of creatures are out there, who are the groups, and that means, you know, looking at vindictive insiders, ethno-nationalists, criminal enterprises, ideological militants, nations, states, and rogue corporations. Those are the 6 categories we break them down into for analytic purposes. We look at what the creatures need, the motives. Wynn and a couple of you long ago saw me lay out how to quantify the ways cyber attackers could gain from an attack. I can show you how to mathematically quantify what attackers gain from the attack, regardless of what kind of attackers they are. There are 7 kind of ways you can do it, and we can estimate those. We look at what the opportunities are they could exploit. That means looking at targets through the eyes of attackers, which requires being culturally relative and understanding how things will appear, what the category systems for decisions will be by different attackers. And then, probably most important, is we look at what adaptations would allow those attacks. And we spend in my organization a lot of time tracking capabilities. We have some really powerful tools for estimating the cost of capabilities. We look at the decay rate of capabilities. We look at the rate at which some of the groups we're looking at are acquiring capabilities, what their expenditures can be, what the remaining expenditure to cross a threshold will be relative to the return, and so on. So we do a kind of an ecological, economic analysis of attackers. This has worked. I think I probably personally have the best record of anybody for anticipating new kinds of cyber attacks for more than a decade. My chief rivals for this would be the people I work with, like John Baumgartner and probably Warren Axelrod and some of the others. We've called every major new development cyber attacks at least since 2002. We've been often ridiculed for them for a year or 2 or 3, and then afterwards people could hardly believe they needed it. It was so obvious they could hardly believe they needed somebody like me to tell them this is what was coming. The most famous one was my prediction of Stuxnet. I was the guy who predicted all the main features of Stuxnet, its exact target, exactly how it would destroy it, 14 months before it was found. It was actually already being operating, you know, being put together. It wasn't the main Stuxnet actually hadn't been launched yet, but it was clearly in the works, unbeknownst to me. But we took the kind of analysis that I'm talking about here, and we could just say, you know, this is the obvious move for Israel. There was a lot of talk at that time of launching a series of bombing raids and land war on Iran. And so in order to remind people there are other alternatives, I made this prediction to a Reuters reporter. So I'm on the wire services more than a year before Stuxnet was found with this prediction in some detail, and I did it in some other public forums. That's the most famous, but it's only one of basically the whole series of them. We can come back to that if you want. I've got some for the future that I've uncorked relatively recently. So then consequences. We have to take consequences apart analytically. To understand consequences, you have to look at operations that create value. And you can use the same model. I can show you how to use the same model, whether you're talking about a business, a governmental agency, or government activity, or a military activity. Any operation that's creating value in the eyes of the people carrying it out or benefiting from it is taking inputs and it's turning them into outputs. The outputs are benefits gained. The inputs are benefits lost, benefits sacrificed. We can break down all productive operations into a series of these kinds of arrows, of inputs into outputs. We can measure these because a business operation is producing outputs for which customers have a willingness to pay, using inputs for which suppliers have an opportunity cost. These are in difference point. Willingness to pay is based on the best alternative for the customers, for the people paying, if they don't make this purchase, if they don't go with this option. So willingness to pay is an indifference point. If you are offered something for a price higher than your willingness to pay, you won't do the deal, you won't carry out the operation. If it's a price lower than your willingness to pay, you will, because it will now be your best option. Same way with opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is based on the supplier's best option if they don't do this deal. It's the best expenditure of resources for the military commander if the commander is not carrying out this operation. It's whatever else you would do with the inputs if you're not doing this. So there's kind of a number there. Not necessarily in dollars, it might be lives or some other measurement, although it's usually helpful to just convert them all into dollars. If you then if you're offered an opportunity, a payment basically above your opportunity cost, you do the deal. If it's below, you don't. So we've got clear numbers. In business-to-business relationships, businesses know what these are. They're hard numbers that the businesses have when they go into negotiation. In some other contexts, it's a little bit hard to pin them down, but they're there. That's the tipping point for the decision. So that gives us a nice, clear way to measure the value created. Wait, I'm going wrong direction here. Is that where I was? Partly my eyesight problem here. Okay. To actually analyze consequences, there are four things you have to look at. You have to look at what the effect is, and you know how far it extends as the immediate effect. You have to look at what substitutes. When you run an attack, the world doesn't end, everybody isn't vaporized. Actually, we know how to quantify that too. But you know, something substitutes, something goes on. People do something else. Businesses do something else. So you always have to look at what substitutes. You always have to look at the dependencies. That's the up and down the supply chain. That's the knock-on effects. And you have to look at how long it lasts, duration. So those are kind of the four key things you look at in analyzing consequences. And by the way, these four things also are the model of resilience. If you want to improve resilience, you reduce the effects, you improve the substitutes, you reduce the dependencies, and you shorten the duration. And this will actually generate a whole set of strategies for doing those things. There are other, actually, some powerful modeling uses of these four categories as well. Just mentioning it to give you a flavor of what's going on here. So we want to measure the effect of a cyber attack or any other event. We look at how much value, if it's a destructive attack, we look at how much value was created before the attack, and we compare it to how much value was created after the attack, and we just subtract. There are little arrows here to indicate this is a supply chain. This actually can be quite a complex map of arrows converging and diverging and a really intricate workflow map, and that's actually what it often is. To do the analysis in that case, we're just drawing a circle around a clump of it where we can measure what goes into the circle and what comes out of the circle. Anytime we can draw a circle and do inputs and outputs, we can do the analysis. We can also scale this to something very small or very large. The smallest thing I've ever done this analysis for was an SKF ball bearing. One ball bearing with a sensor. I could figure out value created by that. The largest thing we've done the analysis for are entire industries, like the entire electrical industry, large parts of the economy. All the work I do is technically cooperative game theory-based microeconomics, but it's scalable micro, so it's possible to make macro statements, to talk about large-scale economic events, even though it's still theoretically a kind of micro. And vulnerabilities. We also need to take apart vulnerabilities for mechanism. Key thing here is to look at a cyber attack in terms of each of the main things it has to do. A cyber attack to be successful, to accomplish anything, actually is not about penetrating. It has to do 5 things. You have to find the target. You have to penetrate the target. You have to co-opt the target in some way. You have to conceal what you're doing long enough to have an effect. And you have to do something that can't be easily reversed, that they can't undo by just going to a backup. So a successful cyber attack has 5 things it has to do. We can lay out those 5 things on one side of a grid, and we can lay out our information systems on the other side of the grid, and we get something that looks like that. This is kind of your main categories of an information system: hardware, software, network, automation, humans, and suppliers. And we've got what's findable, what's penetrable, what's co-optable, concealable, and irreversible. This is a comprehensive grid. Every attack technique can be located on this grid, Every defensive technique can be located on this grid. It's a powerful analytic tool for advanced malware because we can use this grid to map out what an advanced complex tool does. By the way, when you populate this grid with attack tools, all the squares are pretty well populated. By the way, we've done this, except of course the squares, each square is more than a page long. I mean, it's pages, so I can't like project it. But you populate it with attack tools, it's pretty well populated. You populate it with defensive tools, and there's something here and there everywhere, but all our defensive tools are really piled into 2.5 squares. They're piled into preventing penetration of software and networks, and then we do a certain amount of backups, making things reversible. And most of that is really underpopulated. So this is a powerful tool for figuring out both defense and attacks. It's also a powerful tool for looking at vulnerabilities collectively. So when we're analyzing the collective effect of vulnerabilities, we're actually doing a kind of a more elaborated version of this, and we're watching how attacks would get through each of the different phases, being able in many cases, depending upon your modularization, to substitute, an avenue up or down the scale to move on to the next level. And of course, when we're doing that, software and hardware and so on breaks down into a lot of components, and the analysis gets fairly detailed. When we then apply this, we can look at the collective effect of vulnerabilities and all the different kinds of vulnerabilities and estimate what the success of a given attack will be. When we're rating attacks and looking at threats, we're always looking at the level of capabilities. We're always looking at what's the skill level of the attackers and the amount of time those capabilities, those skills, that expertise has to be applied. And when we're looking at vulnerabilities, we don't care whether something can be found or penetrated or whatever. What we really care about is the level of expertise and for what period of time for doing those things. So we put these together, and we can actually come up with we can identify a particular kind of attack and say how soon or how likely we can expect it. We can say what the consequences will be of carrying out that attack successfully, what the loss will be. And you have to do them, by the way, in this order. You can't talk about consequence without talking about the consequence of an attack, of a threat. And it's only after you've talked about consequence that you can really do vulnerabilities correctly and say the degree to which we will suffer this consequence given this threat. We can put these together then, and we get a frequency number for a threat, we get a quantity number for a consequence, and we get a percentage of that consequence number for vulnerability, and we can literally just multiply them together and get an annualized expected loss number, get us an expected measurement of risk. And it's the same measurement of risk that CFOs and business people use all the time in every other kind of context, or should be using. So this turns cybersecurity into quantitative, numerical answers that will defend cybersecurity budgets rather easily, by the way, that will also allow military commanders to talk about quantitatively about what they're doing. And we can run this looking at different policies, different defensive mechanisms. We can talk about ways to change the threat, to reduce the size of the box that somebody put on the screen earlier, Jorge, I think. The box, which is threat times consequence times vulnerabilities. There's a little bit different labels. They used impact instead of consequence, and labels were different. But it's a big rectangle if you're rectangular box if you're multiplying these. So you can actually talk about ways to reduce the threat, ways to reduce the consequence, ways to reduce the vulnerability, and you can run this calculation for different policies. And so you can make the whole thing quantitatively. Now, when you do this, the numbers are often very rough. We use honest numbers, and people, especially the media, to whom we supply a lot of numbers, are often disappointed in our numbers because they're only of order of magnitude a lot of the time. Sometimes they're relatively precise, but a lot of the time they're only order of magnitude numbers. And occasionally we'll have a number that we're really proud of, and where it's only accurate within 2 orders of magnitude. And people go, what's the use of this? But actually, for most policy decisions, most military, business, government decisions, that's good enough. If you know that a given attack is going to cost you millions, not tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands, and not tens of millions or hundreds of millions, but it's going to cost you millions, that's good enough for a policy. So that's basically the kind of analysis we've been doing. We also look at this analysis in terms of what's coming. It's not retrospective. We want to look at the business opportunities, because the main driver of cybersecurity is not, of course, cybersecurity. It's not the government. It's the onward rush of the global economy seizing new business opportunities. These are kind of the key 6 transforming information systems right now. I can return to those if you want to hear about them. Flexible reallocation of capacity is things like what the smart grid is really all about, what cloud computing is really all about. So each of these you probably are quite familiar with, but these are kind of the abstract labels that allows me to group them together and say that there only are 6 or 8 different opportunities right now that are changing the world economy. And it also, these are the concept labels that allow me to show you how to quantify all of these. The goal for cybersecurity then that emerges when you take this risk-based approach is simply to reduce the risk by not just piling on more cybersecurity, but thinking about how can we actually change the consequences and change the threats as well. So we can talk about how to reduce cybersecurity. And the goal then for cyber defense becomes increasing attacker costs. You can't stop an attacker. If my guy, John Bumgarner, goes after you, as a lot of people can testify to their sorrow, he will find a way. The red team who does base cybersecurity testing for the Army, they always get in. And in fact, if you give a tester, especially if we're talking about penetration, if you give them enough latitude of operations and they're really good, they will always find a way. So you don't care whether they got in or not. And the same is true of the other different components of a cyber attack. You don't care if they were able to do any one of those 5 things on any system. What you care is what level of expertise for what period of time it took, which is the main thing shaping the cost. And more broadly, you want to know what was the cost of the attack. If you could increase the cost of the attack so that it's greater than the gain from the attack, you've won completely. You've won absolutely. If you could increase the cost of attacking you or your system so it's greater than alternative targets, you've won relatively. And this is an achievable way of thinking about it. People say, we're up against People's Liberation Army attackers. How can we defend ourselves? They can, if they really want to, they will get in. Yes, of course they can get in. But you can increase their cost of doing that by a factor of 10 by applying, sensible cybersecurity program. Even the People's Liberation Army can't afford to have 10 times the expenditure on carrying out cyber attacks, nor can the NSA for that matter. It's not hard to increase the NSA's cost of stealing your information by many, many times over. So looking at costs and looking at cyber attacks in this risk-based way gives you achievable goals. It gives you a way to win, at least in relative terms. And it allows you to sell cybersecurity as an enabler of value creation, as an enabler of government or military operations. And it makes claiming your budget really easy. A key kind of general observation, and then I think I'm through with the part here that I wanted to use as summary. Yeah. So a key general observation here is that when we're looking at mechanisms, we're not arguing about boxes to put things in. This is like the opposite of a military approach where you want to know who's got responsibility, who gets command, who's got the turf, and you spend a lot of time arguing about what the boxes are. This is about building out the actual mechanisms, and then afterwards, if you want to apply some labels, you've got a rigorous way of doing it. And the models we're talking about here are real models. We're not talking about models. The military will have a bunch of boxes, and they'll say, well, we can put most stuff in these boxes, so we'll call that a model. That's not what we're doing here. We're talking about actual connecting mechanisms that we can quantify. So we're talking about models in a computer modeling sense. But the models we're using aren't any that are black box models, are where we trust the computer. They're all models that are totally transparent to humans at every juncture. And the math, by the way, is mostly easy math. We do, as I said, multivariable change point detection is math that I can't actually do. I have to hand it to one of my mathematician colleagues. But most of the math we do is just areas between curves. And yeah, we've got some summation things that are tricky, and there's integral calculus and a bit of differential equations. But mostly it's not hard math. And most of it I can explain in a PowerPoint to mathematically illiterate senior executives. So then we've also looked at quantifying the contribution of cyber attacks to military operations. I've done a lot of work on that. The nice thing there was that people were saying, well, cyber is going to be a force multiplier, isn't it? And we did the analysis, and a lot of the time, actually, the physical operation was the force multiplier, or the way of harvesting the return. Cyber often was the main event. We've gone through and looked at, well, you can imagine, just kind of all the different pieces. We do a lot of looking at this from an attacker standpoint. You can do the same analysis from an attacker standpoint. A lot of what's in Carver maps into this, except Carver assumes that people pulling Carver are going to be the attackers, so it doesn't. It's a special ops, Army special ops category, so it doesn't actually analyze capabilities much. The ones for M-sharp and those have a bit the reverse problem. They're mostly defensive, and so they're less complete. But we can basically take all those different models, map them into ours, quantify them, and in some cases provide a better defense of those models than the people articulating. So at this point, whatever you want me to talk about in cybersecurity, I'll tackle.
That question. Interesting talk, by the way. It sounds a bit like business impact assessments to me. The question I have.
So I hate impact because
I know.
Impact suggests that it's a sharp, condensed thing. And often the consequence is quite diffuse and gradual, and there's no impact to look for. And these words are important to get people to remember possibilities. I hate the military emphasis on, taking it out, shutting it down, whatever, because destroying things is such a crude way to destroy value. If you want to destroy value, you don't want to destroy a system. I mean, hardly ever. What you want to do is hijack the system to destroy value for you, and you can do so much more harm with a cyber attack than you can with a bomb or a hammer as a consequence. So the words here matter a lot.
So how do you quantify areas which might be not quantifiable? Because not every business process creates value. And the business processes sometimes, if you're a multinational, for instance, it can be quite complex. Yeah. So how would you model that?
So often that's tricky. I got into this field. I have a techie background. I did, I'm old enough, so I first learned to not program. I'm not a programmer, but I first learned to not program in Fortran and Lisp, and now I not program in Python. And I have and I give technical papers, as some of you know, periodically. And I do work in modeling of complex systems and all the rest of it. But mostly, I spent the 90s as an economist, and my specialty as an economist was showing people how to quantify areas of value creation, and by extension value destruction, that they didn't know you could quantify, including damage to customer relationships. When they were your customers before the attack, they're still your customers after the attack, but something got damaged, and I can show you how to figure it out and how to quantify it. Amount of value you're creating by information, and all the different ways you can use information to create value. I can show how to quantify those. Damage to confidence, to trust, damage to brand, diffuse intellectual property. That's what I came into this field knowing. So that's my home ground, and I'm happy to, but that's the answers to those questions are often a pretty long lecture or course in themselves.
Scott, if you had a retailer whose brand was damaged and you scoured that up across the country whose retail value was damaged, can you put numbers by country on the scale of Chinese poor quality work when tied to its IPR theft?
In principle, yeah. Yeah, some of this is tricky, but in principle, yeah.
Have you done any of those studies?
We've done a number of them at the back of the envelope level, and we've provided the back of the envelope version to people who actually use that for policy decisions, because, as I say, often that's good enough. We haven't been funded to do some of the studies that are a little different than what you're describing, but are kind of in that general area that we'd love to do.
The reason I say this is Huawei are very strong on quality. They beat up their European suppliers for quality. And I just get the feeling that quality is being used by the Chinese military-industrial complex, whereby even a broken zipper is denying you quality at the micro level to the extent where your own economy is wiped out by the poor quality that your greedy vendors have accepted.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big subject. I'm probably the first person to call attention publicly to the extent to which China was stealing our competitively important business information. And I've given many, many talks and things just on quantifying consequences of Chinese
There's a reason
activity.
why a company like Huawei is so strong on the quality. Is quality being used as a weapon against us? That's in the back of my mind.
So the short answer is not particularly. The main thing China is doing is allowing industries to operate without any obligation to make profit so that they can take over critical infrastructure supply chain components globally. And they've been doing that for a lot of years now.
Thank you.
Scott, you said you might have some relevant prediction for the coming cyber attacks. Could you?
So I have a really big general prediction, and I can also send you a paper on it. I've only done one really big general prediction in the past, and that was in 2002. I said that mass disruption viruses were a thing of the past, and that cybercrime was no longer going to be adolescents operating for bragging rights. It was about to be professionalized. Organized crime was going to get involved. People with engineering and computer science degrees, people, MBAs, and it was all going to be professionalized. And, and I said that they started outlining the attacks of the future, and I said mass disruption viruses were not part of it. This is in 2002. Over the next couple of years, we had the worst mass disruption viruses, the most destructive mass disruption viruses we'd ever had. And we had examples of extraordinary attacks mounted by teenagers for bragging rights. And I was quite ridiculed. I really was ridiculed. But by 2004, nobody could believe the professionalization of cybercrime was so obvious that nobody could believe they'd ever been skeptical of what I had to say. Nobody could believe that they needed me to tell them what was happening. It was so obvious. So my big one right now is that the cybercrime of the future will be indirect payoff cybercrimes. Cybercrimes where the profit is going to be made in markets, especially financial markets. And I'm saying this, we've been watching this, and I've actually talked a little about this in the past, but now it's beginning to gather steam. And so now I've gone at the FSISAC back last early summer or late spring, whenever that was. I actually talked about this for the financial services ISAC.
Scott, I'm glad you brought up FSISAC, and I know Lars has had a question, and what you're...
Let me finish what the prediction means first, and then we can talk about the FSISAC if you want. So basically I said there's a limit. The reasoning is this. There's a limit to how much money you can steal by bogus credit card charges. That's mostly what cyber fraud is. It's bogus credit card charges. There's some of it is improper payment transfers out of accounts. Both of those have a ceiling. And even though reverse money laundering and so on makes the money extraordinarily difficult to trace, in principle we will get better and better at tracing where the money goes. So that whole basis of international cybercrime does no longer has great growth prospects. It's not to say it won't be the worst now in the next couple of years that it's ever been, the way it, last time I made a big prediction. But there's a limit. There is no limit to the amount of money you can make by stealing information that will allow you to anticipate a financial market, or by carrying out an attack that will make a financial market move. So you can go short on a stock, attack that company if it's cyber vulnerable, and send the stock plummeting. You can take on an airline, for instance. Airlines are dependent for almost all their sales. They depend on a couple of websites. If you ran an attack, man-in-the-middle attack, in effect, which could be, of course, website corruption, on one of those airlines. So you booked everybody buying tickets onto the same seats on the same days, and then you ran up every possible credit card charge on their accounts. People would stop using that airline. An airline is a commodity, basically, and nobody would click on that airline anymore. An airline could sustain a 5% drop in sales for an extended period of time. Our projections are that you could produce maybe a 60% drop in sales for an extended period of time. Unless the industry becomes self-insuring and gets together some agreements to protect against this, you could drive any airline into bankruptcy by this. So you pick an airline trading at, say, $58 a share. You'd have to pay about $7 of those dollars. You'd have to pay about $7 in fees to get your put options issued. But for every additional dollar that airline fell, you could get 100% profit. You could multiply your investment by 100% for every dollar it fell. You could reinvest on the way down. When an airline goes into bankruptcy, we know all about what happens because it's happened a number of times. It takes about a month, and they go down to $1 a share roughly. So you could play that, reinvest on the way down, multiply your investment by hundreds of times. Commodity markets are already highly leveraged. Most commodity markets are highly concentrated on one end or the other. There are a limited number of producers or a limited number of customers that dominate a commodity market. Commodity markets are so highly leveraged that already you're losing or gaining your entire investment with a very small shift in the market. So hit a major producer or a major consumer of the commodity with a SCADA organized attack that will do physical damage to their facilities, cut their demand for a commodity for several months. Suddenly that commodity market moves. So and then the more basic one is simply steal business information from, invest in a company, steal business information from rival companies, damage the rival companies' reputations, feed the business information you've stolen and the company you're backing. There's a lot of that going on right now. That's been actually already a big growth area. The People's Liberation Army spin-offs are started, gosh, it must be maybe 2.5, 3 years ago now. They started offering espionage for hire, technical research service, technical business research services, very high priced. You get to specify what technology, what business information you want, and for rather large sums, they will go and find it for you. But this appears to be basically subsidiaries of the People's Liberation Army going commercial as the generals retire, so they can, run the commercial enterprise and make money. As some of you probably know, something like half the venture capital or more than that in China's People's Liberation Army, and I don't know what it is now. A few years ago, half of the income, half of the financing of the People's Liberation Army wasn't directly from government taxes, it was from their business ventures. So we've watched a big migration there, and we've watched rival services now being set up out of the Eastern European, ethnic Russian talent. So this is all beginning to get rolling. At what point this will get going, it's a little hard to say. When we've been wrong about predictions in the past, we've never been wrong about what we predicted so far. And by the way, we're not going to be able to sustain this. We've had a hot streak. We've been better than we can account for. We've been lucky. But clearly it's not all luck, or we wouldn't have been doing this anyway. When we've been wrong in the past, it's because we thought something would happen a lot sooner than it did. And we've been wrong because we keep underestimating the incredible conservatism of organized crime. Organized crime is just enormously risk adverse. Yeah. And it makes sense if you think about it. If you're running an operation and you lose $1 million of venture capital money, you shrug it off and hope you do better on your next venture. Hope you make money for them next time. You lose $1 million of the Russian mob's money, and you get pretty nervous about ever opening your door. You might open the door to a bullet in your face. So given that atmosphere, organized crime is really risk adverse, and they miss out on business opportunities and postpone seizing them for years at a time. And that's why this one that I'm predicting now might be slow developing. We see big new developments in cybercrime when a new part of the world starting out with new cybercrime organizations. They tend not to go into competition with what's already there. They try to move into new territory. We do our black swan analysis, and we can say where we need to start watching for signs of a new group of organized cybercrime cropping up. We can do the ecological analysis and predict that. What did you?
Okay. A couple questions came up, and I'll get the larger.
Give me yours first.
Yeah, go.
When's pointing at you?
Predictions and cybercrime. We were discussing this earlier about this new scheme that seems to be without consequences for the bad guys, the crypto locker stuff, which is a pain in the ass for Europeans. 96 hours, that's what you have to pay. Otherwise, your hard disk is wiped out, and it takes out your server as well if it's connected to that. So as long as people don't have total offline backup,
it's been kind of interesting to watch the resurgence of that, because we first saw that when cybercrime was still mostly being, when commercial cybercrime was still mostly being directed at organizations without government protection, which meant things like offshore gambling. And we first saw that attack being carried out against offshore gambling operations. And it was a flurry of activity a lot of years ago on that. And it's been kind of interesting to watch it revive. The limit on that is companies have a limit to how much they will pay for ransom to unlock their stuff. They have a limit of capital, if nothing else, on hand. And there's a payment trail that eventually is going to be rigged in ways that will allow a lot of these people to be caught.
But these ones are mostly going on the private individuals, not companies, because the small number creates much more revenue than going for bigger companies that have better policies in place. But it seemed to be a success story for the bad guys so far. There's no mitigation.
But it's not big. It's not really big money thing. I mean, it's massive enough, so yeah, somebody's getting very rich on it. A lot of people are probably getting rich on it.
But as long as it doesn't stop and you can mitigate it, it will rise.
Yeah. So we track those kinds of things as well. We don't just worry about we make a lot of really small predictions, a lot of calls. But we're not actually in the prediction business. We're in the prepare America and its allies and critical infrastructures for, so that they are not victim of horrible things in the future. That's the capsule description of what my organization does is I say, if I need to talk to the general public and they say, well, what do you do? And I say, our job is to figure out how to destroy America and its allies using computers, and then what's the cheapest thing we can do to make it harder. So that's really our main brief.
Scott, with respect to all the modeling that you guys have done, have there been any cyber defense models or paradigms that you guys have looked at that jumps out as being more or less effective relative to others that maybe we should be leveraging either as a government or an industry or both?
So we have a lot of recommendations about relatively small-scale strategies and effects. We can say a lot of separate little bits of advice about what are good things to do in companies. They can range from policy statements like, it's really great if you can get your cybersecurity people to report to the CFO, not the CIO. We can say, these kinds of intrusion detection technologies, if you combine them with these kind of firewalls, are redundant, and so you need to get rid of one or the other, and you're wasting money, and blah, blah. We have a lot of things like that. More broadly, the markets for cybersecurity aren't delivering better cybersecurity. They're demonstrably broken. When a market is broken, there are 7 possible reasons why the market could be broken. It's really 6 main ones, and then there's sort of an afterthought minor one. And each of those has remedies. So, since, so we tell the federal government without being able to completely convince them yet, but what they need to be thinking about is not mandating standards that are going to be not only by the time they're agreed upon, let alone applied, they're not only going to be obsolete, they're probably going to be an impediment to doing the security you need. So we've been telling the government, instead of focusing on standards, you should be focusing on measures you can take that would facilitate the functioning of markets in this area. And that's not government expenditures. It's about one reason that markets might not be working that actually has been touched on in public discussion is markets won't work if there isn't adequate information for making a decision. So Wynn's telling me my time is getting shorter up or something.
As you get older, your time always gets shorter.
And we haven't gotten to what I really wanted to talk about was how cyber war is going to play out.
We have time.
Okay.
I got to get you off the stage.
Okay. So thank you very much. We'll come back to the brainstorming later.